The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over Washington, D.C. Senator Marcus Hayes stepped out of his car and onto the bustling sidewalk outside one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Known for its elegant decor and gourmet cuisine, the Grand Oak was frequented by politicians, celebrities, and influential figures from all walks of life. Tonight, however, it wasn't about politics or networking. It was simply a chance for Marcus to unwind after a grueling day on Capitol Hill. Dressed in a casual yet polished ensemble, a navy blue blazer paired with dark jeans and leather shoes, Marcus exuded quiet confidence. His presence commanded respect without demanding attention, but he preferred it that way. At 48 years old, Marcus had spent decades navigating both the corridors of power and the complexities of being a black man in America. He carried himself with grace, though he knew well the weight of stereotypes that often preceded him wherever he went. As he entered the restaurant, the faint sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations filled the air. The hostess greeted him warmly, her smile genuine as she asked how many were in his party. "Just me tonight," Marcus replied softly, his deep voice carrying an air of calm authority. She nodded and picked up a menu before gesturing toward the dining area. But instead of leading him to one of the plush booths near the window, a spot reserved for solo diners who wanted privacy, she hesitated briefly, then motioned toward a small table tucked away near the kitchen doors. Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, nor would it be the last. Over the years, he'd learned to pick his battles carefully. This wasn't worth making a fuss over yet. He followed her silently, sliding into the chair with practiced ease. As he glanced around the room, he noticed other patrons stealing quick looks at him. Some seemed curious, others appeared indifferent. A few tables away, a group of sharply dressed businessmen laughed loudly while sipping expensive wine. One of them caught Marcus's eye and gave him a polite nod, which Marcus returned with a slight smile. Minutes passed, and the waiter assigned to his section finally approached. His name tag read, Evan, and his demeanor immediately struck Marcus as odd. Evan stood stiffly, avoiding direct eye contact as he placed a napkin on the table. Without so much as a greeting, he rattled off the evening's specials in a clipped tone, barely pausing for breath. Marcus listened patiently, nodding when appropriate. When Evan finished, Marcus thanked him politely and began perusing the menu. But Evan lingered awkwardly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Finally, he spoke again, his words laced with thinly veiled condescension. "Are you sure you'll be able to afford these items?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the menu. "Some of our dishes can get pretty pricey." The comment hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. Marcus slowly lowered the menu and looked up at Evan, his expression unreadable. For a moment there was silence between them, a charged pause that felt longer than it actually was. Then, Marcus responded, his voice steady and measured. "I think I'll manage," he said simply, his piercing gaze locking onto Evan's. Evan flushed slightly but quickly masked his discomfort with a forced laugh. Right, he muttered, backing away. "Let me know if you need anything. Else." As Evan retreated, Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He hadn't expected this kind of treatment tonight. Not here, not in such a prestigious place. Yet deep down, he wasn't surprised either. Moments like these reminded him why he fought so hard in his career, for change, for equality, for dignity. Still, it stung. Little did Marcus or Evan know that this encounter was only the beginning of what would become an unforgettable night. Marcus Hayes sat quietly at his table, his mind racing despite the calm exterior he projected. He had faced prejudice countless times before, whether it was being followed in stores, questioned about his credentials, or dismissed outright. But each incident left its mark. This time, however, something felt different. Perhaps it was the setting, an upscale restaurant where civility was supposed to reign supreme. Or perhaps it was Evan's blatant disregard for professionalism that struck a nerve. Whatever it was, Marcus decided then and there that he wouldn't let this moment pass unnoticed. Evan returned moments later, carrying a glass of water with more force than necessary. He set it down on the table with a sharp clink, causing a few droplets to splash onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Here you go," Evan said curtly, avoiding eye contact once again. His body language screamed discomfort, but beneath it lay traces of arrogance, as if he believed himself superior simply because of the uniform he wore and the skin color he shared with most patrons here. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deliberate sip of water, savoring the coolness as it slid down his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tone of quiet authority. "Tell me, Evan," he began, leaning forward slightly, "do you always treat your customers this way?" The question caught Evan off guard. He blinked rapidly, clearly unprepared for such directness. For a fraction of a second, guilt flickered across his face, but just as quickly, it hardened into defensiveness. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," Evan replied, his tone clipped. "I'm just doing my job." "Is that so?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you're treating me differently than others." Evan shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the room as if searching for an escape route. "Look, I don't have time for this," he muttered, under his breath loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Are you ready to order, or should I come back later?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Evan with a mixture of curiosity and disappointment. Here was a young man, likely no older than his mid-20s, who seemed to carry the weight of misplaced entitlement. It wasn't uncommon for people to harbor biases, but seeing them acted out so openly was jarring. Still, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what had shaped Evan's worldview. Was it ignorance? Fear? A lifetime of absorbing societal messages without questioning their validity? "I'll take the grilled salmon," Marcus said evenly, handing over the menu. "And please, bring another napkin. The first one seems to have missed the table entirely." Evan flushed red, embarrassment warring with indignation. He snatched the menu from Marcus's hands and turned on his heel, muttering something unintelligible as he walked away. Marcus watched him go, shaking his head slightly. The encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth, though it wasn't entirely unexpected. As he waited for his food, Marcus allowed his thoughts to drift. He thought about the countless conversations he'd had with colleagues, friends, and constituents about systemic racism and microaggressions. How many times had he explained that change required uncomfortable truths, that progress demanded accountability? And yet here he was, experiencing firsthand the very attitudes he worked tirelessly to dismantle. A nearby couple caught his attention. They were seated at a prime table by the window, enjoying animated conversation over plates of steak and lobster. Their server, a young woman with a warm smile, hovered attentively, refilling their wine glasses and laughing lightly at their jokes. Watching her interact with them made the disparity even clearer. Why hadn't Evan approached him with the same level of care and respect? Time ticked by slowly, and Marcus grew increasingly aware of the stares directed his way. Some were curious, others judgmental. One older gentleman at a neighboring table gave him a sympathetic nod, while a younger woman appeared visibly uncomfortable, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. When Evan eventually returned with Marcus's meal, he placed the plate down with unnecessary force, causing the silverware to clatter loudly. "Here's your salmon," he announced stiffly, avoiding any further eye contact. "Thank you," Marcus replied, his voice steady and polite. But as Evan turned to leave, Marcus added softly, almost to himself, "This isn't over yet." Though Evan didn't hear the remark, the tension between them continued to simmer, setting the stage for what promised to be an unforgettable evening. The grilled salmon sat untouched on Marcus Hayes's plate as he stared at it thoughtfully. The aroma of herbs and lemon wafted up, but his appetite had vanished long before Evan delivered the dish. Instead, his mind churned with questions about how to handle the situation unfolding around him. Should he let it slide, as he often did, in similar circumstances? Or was this the moment to push back, not out of anger, but out of a desire to spark understanding? Evan, meanwhile, hovered awkwardly near the kitchen doors, stealing furtive glances at Marcus. It was clear that their earlier exchange had unsettled him, though whether it stemmed from guilt or frustration remained unclear. Every time another server passed by, Evan would mutter something under his breath, gesturing vaguely toward Marcus's table. Whatever he said seemed to elicit smirks or shrugs from his co-workers, none of whom approached Marcus directly. At one point, a middle-aged couple seated nearby, a man in a tailored suit and his elegantly dressed wife, leaned closer to each other, whispering conspiratorially. The woman glanced at Marcus briefly, her expression sympathetic yet tinged with pity. Her husband, however, looked annoyed, shaking his head slightly as if irritated by the disruption caused by difficult customers. Marcus noticed all of this, the subtle glances, the whispered comments, the palpable tension, but chose not to react. He knew better than anyone that people often formed opinions based on fragments of information, filling in gaps with assumptions, rather than facts. What they didn't know, and what Evan certainly hadn't bothered to find out, was who Marcus truly was beyond the surface. After several minutes of silence, Marcus decided to eat. He picked up his fork and knife deliberately, cutting into the salmon with precision. Each bite tasted bland, not because of the food itself, but because of the weight pressing down on him. Still, he ate slowly, savoring the act of reclaiming control over the moment. Just as he finished his meal, Evan reappeared, clutching a leather-bound check presenter in one hand. Without saying a word, he placed it on the edge of the table and retreated quickly, leaving Marcus alone once again. Inside the folder was the bill, along with a hastily scrawled note. "Hope you enjoyed your dinner." Marcus raised an eyebrow at the sarcastic tone. Clearly, Evan wasn't done airing his grievances. But instead of reacting impulsively, Marcus pulled out his wallet and retrieved a credit card. As he slid it into the folder, he paused for a moment, considering his next move. He signaled for Evan to return, holding up the check presenter until the young waiter reluctantly approached. When Evan arrived, Marcus handed him the folder without breaking eye contact. "I'd like to speak with your manager," he said calmly, his voice firm but devoid of hostility. Evan froze, panic flashing across his face. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, his tone suddenly nervous. "No problem," Marcus replied evenly. "But I think it's important we address some concerns before I leave." Evan swallowed hard, clearly unsure of how to respond. After a beat, he nodded stiffly and turned toward the kitchen, disappearing behind the swinging doors. Moments later, a tall woman with sharp features and a polished appearance emerged. She introduced herself as Claire, the restaurant's manager, and extended a warm smile as she approached Marcus's table. "Good evening, Senator Hayes," she said, her voice smooth and professional. Marcus blinked in surprise. "You know who I am?" Claire nodded, her demeanor shifting slightly. "Of course, you've been instrumental in shaping policies that affect our community. We're honored to have you here tonight." For the first time since entering the restaurant, Marcus felt a flicker of validation. Yet he couldn't ignore the irony of the situation. Claire recognized him only after seeing his credit card, an unmistakable indicator of his status. If he hadn't used it, would she have treated him any differently? "I appreciate the kind words," Marcus began, leaning forward slightly, "but I'm afraid my experience here tonight hasn't lived up to the standards I expected." Claire's smile faltered, replaced by genuine concern. "I'm so sorry to hear that. Could you tell me what happened?" As Marcus recounted the events leading up to this moment, Claire listened intently, her expression growing increasingly troubled. By the end of his explanation, she looked both embarrassed and determined. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Senator," she said earnestly. "Please allow me to make things right." But Marcus wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about him. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't face the same treatment in the future. And little did Claire or Evan realize, Marcus intended to hold them accountable in ways they couldn't anticipate. Claire, the restaurant manager, stood beside Marcus Hayes' table with her hands clasped tightly together. Her polished demeanor from moments ago had begun to crack under the weight of his calm, but pointed recounting of the evening's events. She nodded frequently as he spoke, occasionally interjecting with murmured apologies, but it was clear that she hadn't anticipated this kind of confrontation tonight. "I understand how frustrating this must have been for you, Senator," Claire said finally, her voice tinged with both sincerity and unease. "Please know that this is not reflective of our values or standards as a business." Marcus studied her carefully, noting the genuine concern in her eyes. He believed her when she said the behavior didn't align with the restaurant's ethos, but that only made the situation more troubling. If racism could rear its head so blatantly in an establishment like the Grand Oak, where civility and professionalism were supposedly paramount, then what hope was there for places less scrutinized? "Thank you for acknowledging my experience," Marcus replied evenly. "But I want to be clear, I'm not here seeking personal vindication. This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I did tonight." Claire nodded again, though her expression grew increasingly conflicted. On one hand, she understood the gravity of Marcus's words. On the other, she knew all too well the challenges of managing a diverse staff in a high-pressure environment. Evan wasn't the first employee to make mistakes, nor would he likely be the last. Yet something about this case felt different, more consequential than a mere slip-up. Before Claire could respond further, Evan appeared hesitantly at the edge of the dining area, hovering near the kitchen doors. His face was pale, his posture rigid as if bracing for impact. Clearly, he'd overheard enough of the conversation to realize that his actions were now under intense scrutiny. Claire turned toward him, gesturing sharply for him to approach. "Evan," she called out, her tone firm yet controlled. "Come, here please." Reluctantly, Evan shuffled forward, stopping a few feet away from Marcus's table. His eyes darted between Claire and Marcus, unable to settle on either for more than a second. When Claire motioned for him to step closer, he obeyed reluctantly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Senator Hayes has shared some concerns about your conduct tonight," Claire began, her voice measured but laced with authority. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Evan opened his mouth to speak but faltered immediately. Words seemed to catch in his throat as he struggled to find an explanation, or perhaps an excuse, that wouldn't dig him deeper into trouble. Finally, after several agonizing seconds, he managed a feeble reply. I didn't mean any disrespect, ma'am. I was just doing my job." Marcus arched an eyebrow at the response, his expression unreadable. "Doing your job doesn't involve questioning whether someone can afford their meal," he interjected, calmly. "And it certainly doesn't include treating them differently based on assumptions you've made about who they are." Evan flinched visibly, his cheeks flushing red. For the first time since the evening began, he looked directly at Marcus, not with defiance, but with shame. It was as though the weight of his actions had finally sunk in, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Claire sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of her nose as if warding off an impending headache. "Evan, we pride ourselves on providing exceptional service to every guest regardless of background or appearance. What you displayed tonight falls far short of those expectations." "I'm sorry," Evan muttered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to cause any problems." "It's not enough to apologize," Marcus said gently but firmly. "Actions matter more than words. How will you ensure that this doesn't happen again, not just with me, but with anyone else? Who walks through those doors?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Evan shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared to answer. Claire stepped in quickly, sensing the need to diffuse the tension. "Senator Hayes is right," she said, addressing Evan directly. "This is a learning opportunity, for you and for us as a team. Effective immediately, you'll undergo additional training on cultural sensitivity and customer service protocols. Furthermore, I'll be reviewing our policies to identify areas where we can improve inclusivity across the board." Marcus nodded approvingly, though his gaze remained steady on Evan. There was still work to be done, not just within the walls of the Grand Oak, but in the broader world outside. And while tonight's encounter might have started as a personal affront, it had evolved into something much larger, a chance to spark meaningful change. As Claire dismissed Evan with instructions to return to the kitchen, she turned back to Marcus with renewed determination. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Senator. We won't let this moment go to waste." Little did she or Evan realize, however, that Marcus's involvement was far from over. As Claire wrapped up her conversation with Marcus, she extended a gracious offer to comp his meal and provide a gift card for future visits. "Please allow us to make amends," she said earnestly, her tone laced with both apology and determination. "We value your presence here tonight, Senator Hayes, and we're committed to ensuring this never happens again." Marcus accepted the gesture graciously but made it clear that his focus wasn't on personal compensation. "Thank you, Claire," he replied, his voice calm yet resolute. "But what matters most is how you address this moving forward. Not just for me, but for everyone who steps into this restaurant." Claire nodded solemnly, clearly understanding the gravity of his words. As she excused herself to oversee Evan's training plan and review internal policies, Marcus leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the evening's events. He had entered the Grand Oak hoping for a quiet dinner. Instead, he found himself at the center of an uncomfortable yet pivotal moment. While Marcus appreciated Claire's willingness to take responsibility, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was symptomatic of a much larger issue, one that extended far beyond the walls of the restaurant. Prejudice wasn't confined to one person or place. It was embedded in societal structures and attitudes that persisted despite progress. And if someone like him, a respected senator, could face discrimination, what hope did others have? Determined to turn this negative experience into something positive, Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing a series of notes. Ideas flowed rapidly, hosting community forums on racial bias, partnering with local businesses to promote inclusivity, and even drafting legislation aimed at addressing systemic inequities in public spaces. This wasn't just about holding the Grand Oak accountable. It was about creating lasting change. Unbeknownst to Marcus, however, whispers about his identity had begun spreading among the restaurant staff. Word traveled quickly once Claire confirmed his status as a U.S. Senator. By the time dessert orders were being taken, nearly every employee knew who their unassuming patron truly was. Some looked on with admiration, while others seemed uneasy, realizing they may have underestimated him earlier. Evan, meanwhile, sat slumped in the break room, staring blankly at the wall. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on him, and for the first time in years he felt genuinely remorseful. His coworkers avoided him, unsure of what to say or how to act around someone whose behavior had drawn such scrutiny. When Claire returned later, she handed Evan a thick packet of materials related to diversity training and customer service excellence. "This isn't punishment," she explained gently. "It's an opportunity to grow, to become better, not just as an employee, but as a person." Evan nodded numbly, accepting the materials without protest. For the first time, he realized the ripple effects of his actions and the potential consequences if word got out about how he'd treated a sitting senator. Back in the dining area, Marcus prepared to leave. As he stood up and slipped on his jacket, several patrons gave him knowing nods, some even approaching to express their support. One elderly woman clasped his hand warmly, saying, "Thank you for standing up for what's right, Senator. We need more leaders like you." Her words resonated deeply with Marcus, reinforcing his belief that small moments could spark significant change. But as he stepped outside into the cool night air, he knew the real work was only beginning. Little did anyone at the Grand Oak realize, however, that Marcus's story wouldn't end there. News of the incident, and the lessons learned, would soon reach wider audiences, inspiring conversations across the city and beyond. And Evan, whether he liked it or not, would find himself at the heart of those discussions. By the time Marcus Hayes stepped out of the Grand Oak, news of the evening's events had already begun to spread, though not in the way anyone might have expected. A young journalist seated at a nearby table had overheard fragments of the conversation between Marcus, Claire, and Evan. Recognizing the significance of what unfolded, she discreetly snapped a photo of Marcus leaving the restaurant and jotted, down notes on her phone. The next morning, an article titled, "Senator Confronts Bias at Upscale DC Restaurant," appeared on a popular local news website. Within hours, it went viral, sparking widespread discussion across social media platforms. Readers were divided. Some praised Marcus for addressing the issue with grace and dignity, while others criticized the restaurant for allowing such behavior to occur under its roof. For the Grand Oak, the fallout was immediate and intense. Calls poured into the restaurant from curious reporters, outraged patrons, and even corporate sponsors threatening to pull partnerships. Claire spent the entire day fielding inquiries and issuing statements reaffirming their commitment to inclusivity and accountability. Meanwhile, Evan found himself at the center of unwanted attention. Though his name wasn't mentioned in the Tao article, whispers among co-workers made it clear that everyone knew who was responsible. Evan arrived at work the following afternoon looking visibly shaken. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usual swagger was replaced by a nervous shuffle. He avoided eye contact with colleagues, retreating to the kitchen as soon as possible. When Claire summoned him to her office later that day, he braced himself for the worst. "Sit down, Evan," Claire said firmly, but without malice. She slid a printed copy of the viral article across her desk toward him. "Have you seen this?" Evan hesitated before nodding slowly. "Yeah, I saw it online." Claire leaned forward, folding her hands together. "This isn't just about one bad night anymore. It's about how we move forward, as individuals and as a business. Do you understand the impact your actions have had?" Evan swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I messed up, I get it now." "You didn't just mess up," Claire replied, her tone sharpening slightly. "You embarrassed yourself, our team, and this establishment. But more importantly, you hurt someone, a person who deserves respect regardless of where they're sitting or what they're wearing." Tears welled up in Evan's eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. For the first time, he began to grasp the magnitude of his mistake, not just professionally, but personally. Growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, he'd never been forced to confront his own biases. Now those unexamined beliefs had collided head-on with reality, leaving him exposed and humbled. Determined to salvage the situation, Claire outlined a detailed plan for Evan's rehabilitation. In addition to mandatory diversity training, he would also participate in community service projects aimed at fostering understanding across racial lines. Furthermore, she tasked him with writing a formal apology letter, not to Marcus directly, but to be shared publicly as part of the restaurant's broader efforts to rebuild trust. Meanwhile, Marcus wasted no time leveraging the incident for greater good. That same week, he announced plans to host a series of town hall meetings focused on combating systemic racism in public spaces. Invitations were extended to business owners, policymakers, and everyday citizens alike, encouraging open dialogue about prejudice and privilege. At the first meeting, held in a packed auditorium downtown, Marcus recounted his experience at the Grand Oak, not to shame anyone, but to highlight the importance of accountability and education. "Change starts with awareness," he told the crowd, his voice steady and impassioned. "And it grows when we choose to act instead of staying silent." The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet in solidarity. Among them sat Evan, who had decided to attend after receiving an anonymous invitation. As he listened to Marcus speak, tears streamed down his face. Not out of guilt this time, but out of gratitude for being given a chance to learn and grow. Little did either man realize, however, that their paths were destined to cross once more, in ways neither could have anticipated. Weeks passed, and the initial frenzy surrounding the incident at the Grand Oak began to settle. The restaurant implemented sweeping changes under Claire's leadership, including mandatory diversity training for all staff, updated customer service protocols, and partnerships with local organizations dedicated to promoting inclusivity. Signs of progress were evident, not only in the improved interactions between employees and patrons, but also in the growing sense of accountability that permeated every corner of the establishment. Evan, meanwhile, had undergone a profound transformation. attending workshops, volunteering at community events, and engaging in difficult conversations about race and privilege opened his eyes to perspectives he'd never considered before. He realized how deeply ingrained biases could shape behavior without conscious awareness, and how much work was needed to unlearn them. Though the process wasn't easy, Evan approached it with newfound humility and determination. One evening, as he prepared to leave the restaurant after a long shift, Claire called him into her office once more. This time, however, her expression was softer, almost hopeful. "I wanted to share something with you," she said, handing him an envelope. Inside was a letter addressed to Evan from Senator Marcus Hayes. Surprised, Evan hesitated before unfolding the paper. The message was brief, but impactful. "Dear Evan, I appreciate your willingness to reflect on recent events and take steps toward growth. True change begins when we acknowledge our mistakes and commit ourselves to doing better. I believe in second chances, especially when they lead to meaningful action. Keep learning, keep listening, and remember that each of us has the power to create a more inclusive world. Sincerely, Senator Marcus Hayes." Tears pricked Evan's eyes as he read the words over and over again. For weeks, he'd carried the weight of shame, convinced that he'd ruined any chance of redemption. But this letter offered not just forgiveness, it offered hope. Determined to express his gratitude personally, Evan decided to attend another town hall meeting hosted by Marcus. When the event concluded, he lingered nervously near the exit, waiting until most attendees had dispersed. Finally, he mustered the courage to approach Marcus, who stood chatting with a few remaining guests. "Senator Hayes?" Evan asked tentatively, his voice trembling. Marcus turned, recognition flickering across his face. "Evan," he said warmly, extending a hand. "It's good to see you again. I just wanted to thank you for everything," Evan stammered, clutching the letter tightly in his hand. "Your words meant more than I can say. I promise I'm trying to do better, to be better." Marcus smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on Evan's shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask for, Evan. Growth takes time, but the fact that you're here today shows how far you've come already." Their conversation continued briefly, with Marcus offering encouragement and guidance. By the end of it, Evan felt lighter, as if a burden he'd been carrying for months had finally lifted. In the weeks that followed, Evan became actively involved in initiatives aimed at fostering inclusivity within his community. Inspired by Marcus's example, he began mentoring young people, sharing his story openly to emphasize the importance of self-awareness and accountability. As for Marcus, he continued, championing causes close to his heart, using his platform to amplify voices often overlooked or silenced. His encounter with Evan served as a reminder that even the smallest moments of courage could spark monumental change. Though their lives remained vastly different, Marcus and Evan shared a bond forged through adversity and growth, a testament to the enduring power of compassion, understanding, and resilience. And in a world still grappling with division, their journey stood as proof that bridges could be built where walls once stood.